There is something most people never notice about their own thoughts. They believe they are the ones thinking them. They believe that when an idea appears, when a fear rises, when an old memory suddenly returns uninvited in the middle of the night, it is them doing the thinking. But I want you to consider something far stranger, something I spent much of my life trying to understand. What if the mind you believe you control is in fact controlling you? What if the very voice narrating your life right now, the one reading these words in your head, is not entirely yours? This is not philosophy for its own sake. This is something I observed again and again, in patients, in dreams, in myself. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Most people believe the mind is a servant, something that waits quietly until they need it, then produces a thought, a decision, a plan. But Jung believed something very different. I came to understand, through decades of clinical work and personal descent into my own unconscious, that the mind is not a servant at all. It is closer to a kingdom with many rulers, most of them unknown to the person who lives inside it. The problem is this: you were never taught to notice who is actually ruling. Almost nobody realizes that the thought which just crossed your mind, the anxious one, the self-critical one, the one that told you that you are not enough, did not originate from a calm, sovereign self sitting at the center of your being. It came from somewhere else, a fragment, an old wound, a voice inherited from someone who is not even in the room with you anymore. If you've experienced this, and I suspect you have, you will know what I mean. A single sentence spoken decades ago by a parent, a teacher, a rejecting friend, can still rise up inside an adult mind and dictate an entire day's mood. This may explain everything you have ever struggled to understand about yourself. Why you sabotage what you want. Why you feel controlled by moods you did not choose. Why peace seems to visit you only rarely, like a guest who never stays. By the end of this, you will understand something few people ever learn in their lifetime. You will understand what it actually means to control your mind before it controls you. Not through willpower, not through discipline alone, but through something deeper, something I call becoming conscious of what already governs you. Let us begin where I began. Early in my work, I noticed a strange pattern in my patients. They came to me convinced they were rational. Educated men and women, doctors, professors, artists, all certain that their conscious mind was in charge of their lives. And yet in the therapy room, this same rational mind would suddenly collapse. A grown man would weep over a memory he swore he had forgotten. A brilliant woman would confess to repeating the exact pattern of her mother's unhappy marriage, despite swearing her whole life she never would. I began to ask a dangerous question. If the conscious mind is truly in control, why does it keep losing? The answer, I discovered, is that the conscious mind is only a small island in a much larger sea. Beneath it lies what I called the personal unconscious, the private basement of forgotten experiences, buried emotions and old defenses. And beneath that, deeper still, lies something even more vast, the collective unconscious, a layer of the mind shared by every human being who has ever lived, filled with ancient patterns I named archetypes. Most people live their entire lives believing they are standing on solid ground, when in truth they are standing on the surface of an ocean, unaware of the currents moving far below them. This is where almost everyone misunderstands the mind. They imagine controlling it the way one controls a car. Push this pedal, thoughts speed up. Pull this lever, thoughts calm down. But the mind is not a machine you operate from outside. You are, in a very real sense, inside the mind you are trying to control. There is no outside seat from which to command it, unless you build one. And building that seat is the entire work of a human life. Let me tell you about a man I once treated. I will not use his real name. I will call him Anton. Anton came to me because he could not stop working. Not because he loved his work, but because the moment he stopped, an unbearable restlessness rose in his chest, a feeling he described as drowning while standing still. He told me, quite proudly at first, that he had full control over his mind. He decided what to think about. He decided what to feel. Discipline, he said, was the answer to everything. But in our sessions, something else emerged. Every time we approached a memory of his father, a cold, dismissive man who had once told young Anton that rest was for the weak, Anton would change the subject. His hands would tighten, his breathing would shorten, and within minutes he would return, almost automatically, to talking about his work schedule. Anton believed he had mastered his mind. In truth, a single sentence from his childhood was ruling every hour of his adult life, and he could not even see it happening. This is the first hidden law I want you to understand. What you do not make conscious will not disappear. It will return, disguised as fate. I wrote those words once, and I still believe them more than almost anything else I discovered. The parts of ourselves we refuse to look at do not vanish simply because we look away. They sink beneath the surface and begin operating in the dark, shaping our choices, our relationships, our fears, without ever announcing themselves. I call this hidden territory the shadow. The shadow is not evil, though people often assume this when they first hear the word. The shadow is simply everything about yourself that you have judged unacceptable and therefore exiled from your conscious identity. Anger you were told was shameful, ambition you were told was arrogant, grief you were told to hide, desire you were told to suppress. All of it goes somewhere. It does not evaporate. It waits. And here is what Jung discovered next. Something that changes everything about how we think of self-control. The shadow does not stay passive in its exile. It grows hungry for expression, and when it cannot express itself directly, it finds indirect ways. It appears in irrational outbursts, in self-sabotage, in the sudden cruelty of an otherwise gentle person, in addictions that seem to come from nowhere, in relationships where you keep, without meaning to, recreating the very pain you swore to escape. You cannot control what you refuse to see. This is the first and perhaps the most uncomfortable truth about the mind. Think of the mind as a house with many rooms. Most people live comfortably in 2 or 3 rooms near the front door, calling this small space myself. But the house is far larger than they know. There are rooms upstairs filled with old griefs never mourned. There are rooms in the basement holding rage never spoken. And most people spend their entire lives pretending the house has only the rooms they have chosen to enter. Then one day, often in midlife, something knocks from inside a locked door. I have watched this moment in hundreds of patients. A man who has achieved everything society told him to want suddenly feels an emptiness he cannot explain. A woman who has built the perfect controlled life suddenly finds herself in tears for no apparent reason. Society calls this a midlife crisis. I called it something else. I called it the unconscious demanding to be integrated. This is where most people misunderstand the entire process of self-mastery. They believe control means suppression. Push the fear down, silence the anger, ignore the sadness. Discipline the unruly parts of the self into submission. But suppression is not control. Suppression is merely delay, and the unconscious mind has patience far greater than the conscious ego. What is suppressed does not weaken over time. It compounds, like an unpaid debt gathering interest in the dark. True control, the kind I spent my life studying, begins with the opposite instinct, not suppression, but conscious confrontation. Let me offer you a different metaphor, one I often return to. Imagine your mind as a river. Most people try to control the river by building a dam, forcing the water to stop where they choose. For a while, this appears to work. The surface looks calm. But behind that dam, pressure builds silently, and eventually, if the water is never allowed a conscious path forward, the dam breaks in the worst possible moment, flooding everything. Real mastery of the mind is not damming the river. It is learning to walk beside it, understanding its currents, so that you are no longer swept away by what you refuse to acknowledge exists. This requires something most people avoid at all costs: honest self-observation. I want to describe to you a practice I developed, not as a technique for productivity, but as a psychological necessity. I called it active imagination, but you do not need my terminology to use its essence. At the end of each day, I would sit quietly and ask myself which emotion I had avoided feeling that day. Not which task I had avoided doing, which feeling. Almost always there was one. A flicker of envy toward a colleague, quickly dismissed. A wave of fear about my work, quickly rationalized away. A trace of sadness about a friendship that had quietly ended, quickly buried under busyness. I began to understand that each of these small avoidances was a tiny surrender of control. Each time I refused to feel something honestly, I handed a piece of my inner governance over to the unconscious, which would later express that unfelt emotion in a form I could not choose, often at a moment I could not predict. This is the second hidden law. You do not control your mind by refusing to feel. You control your mind by feeling consciously on your own terms, before the feeling finds you unprepared. But there is something even deeper happening beneath the shadow, something I did not fully understand until later in my life. After my own confrontation with the unconscious very nearly broke me, I discovered that the mind is not only shaped by personal experience, it is shaped by patterns far older than any individual life. I called these patterns archetypes, inherited structures of imagination shared across all humanity: the hero, the wise old man, the great mother, the trickster, and most relevant to what we are discussing tonight, the archetype I called the persona. The persona is the mask we present to the world. It is not false, exactly. It is necessary. Without a persona, we could not function in society, could not hold jobs, could not maintain relationships built on predictable behavior. But here is the danger almost nobody realizes. Most people eventually forget they are wearing a mask at all. They come to believe the mask is their true face. When this happens, something tragic occurs inside the mind. The parts of the self that do not fit the mask, the anger the mask cannot show, the vulnerability the mask cannot express, the desires the mask considers inappropriate, all of it is pushed into the shadow I described earlier. The more polished the persona becomes, the darker and more powerful the shadow grows behind it. I saw this most clearly in a woman I will call Elsa. Elsa was, by every external measure, admirable, kind to everyone, endlessly patient, never angry, never demanding, never inconvenient. Her friends called her a saint. But Elsa came to me because she suffered from a mysterious exhaustion no physician could explain, and a recurring dream that terrified her. In the dream, a wild animal, always different, a wolf, a bird of prey, a great black horse, would break into her home and destroy everything inside it, while she stood frozen, unable to move. It did not take long to understand what her unconscious was showing her. Elsa had spent her entire life exiling her own anger, her own desires, her own need to be inconvenient sometimes, because as a child she had learned that love was conditional on being agreeable. Her persona of endless kindness had become so rigid that the part of her holding legitimate anger, legitimate need, legitimate power, had grown wild and foreign to her, appearing in dreams as something almost monstrous, simply because she had never allowed it to exist as human. This is the part nobody talks about when they speak of controlling the mind. You cannot control what you have never allowed yourself to become, and you cannot become whole by amputating the parts of yourself that seem inconvenient or unacceptable. So how, then, does one actually gain control? If suppression fails, and the unconscious cannot simply be commanded, what remains? I call the answer individuation. It is, without exaggeration, the central work of a human life. Individuation is the long, often uncomfortable process of becoming acquainted with every part of yourself, the light and the dark, the admirable and the shameful, until you are no longer ruled unconsciously by what you refuse to see. It is not about eliminating the shadow. It is about befriending it, so that its energy, once dangerous when hidden, becomes available to you as strength. Think of it like this. A fire left unattended in a dry forest is devastating. But the same fire, contained and understood, can heat a home through the coldest winter. The shadow is not your enemy to be destroyed. It is a fire whose location you must know, so that it warms you instead of burning down everything you have built. This process cannot be rushed, and here is something important I must tell you honestly. It cannot be completed through thought alone. I want to describe 3 specific movements I observed again and again in this process. Movements the old alchemist intuited long before psychology existed as a science. They called the first stage nigredo, the blackening. This is the stage where a person confronts what they have avoided. It is often disguised as depression, as crisis, as the collapse of something you believed permanent. It feels like darkness because, for the first time, you are seeing what was always there, simply hidden from view. Most people run from nigredo. They seek distraction, medication, denial, anything to avoid sitting inside that darkness long enough to understand it. But I want you to consider something almost nobody tells you about psychological darkness. It is not punishment, it is information. Every collapse contains, buried inside it, the precise material needed for rebuilding, if you are willing to look. The second stage, albedo, the whitening, begins only after this honest confrontation. It is the stage of clarity, where what was once confusing chaos begins to organize itself into meaning. Patterns become visible. The old wound is no longer simply pain, it becomes understanding. This is where genuine insight is born, not from avoiding suffering, but from having passed through it consciously. And the final stage, rubedo, the reddening, is the stage of integration. This is where the once exiled parts of the self are no longer separate from your identity. The anger becomes healthy assertion. The grief becomes depth of compassion. The ambition once judged as arrogant becomes purposeful direction. Nothing about you needs to be destroyed. Everything about you needs eventually to be understood and included. This is what I mean when I say control of the mind is not suppression. It is integration. A mind at war with itself, forever pushing parts of its own nature into darkness, will always eventually be ambushed by what it has refused to acknowledge. But a mind that has met its own darkness honestly becomes something almost unshakable, not because it has eliminated its weaknesses, but because nothing about itself remains a secret capable of controlling it from the shadows. I want to return now to something I said at the beginning, because I promised you this would eventually connect back. I told you that the voice narrating your life may not entirely be yours. I want you to understand what I meant more precisely now. Many of the thoughts you experience as you are, in fact, inherited complexes, autonomous fragments of psychic energy, formed around old wounds, old fears, old unmet needs, operating almost like separate personalities within the larger structure of your mind. When one of these complexes is triggered, and you suddenly feel disproportionately angry, disproportionately anxious, disproportionately ashamed, it is not truly you speaking. It is a wounded fragment of you, briefly seizing control of the whole. This is not a flaw unique to you. It is the condition of every unexamined mind. The tragedy is not that these fragments exist. The tragedy is living an entire life without ever discovering which fragments are speaking, and mistaking their voice for your own permanent identity. Controlling your mind, then, does not mean silencing every difficult thought that arises. It means developing the capacity to ask, in the moment a strong reaction rises within you, a single honest question. Is this truly me speaking, or is this an old wound speaking through me? This single question, asked consistently over years, changes the entire architecture of a person's inner life. It creates what I called a strengthened ego, not an inflated ego full of arrogance, but a stable center of consciousness, capable of observing its own reactions without being immediately consumed by them. I think of the mind, in its healthiest form, not as a fortress trying to keep enemies out, but as a wise old keeper standing at the center of a vast and sometimes wild landscape, familiar with every path, every shadowed valley, every hidden creature that lives within its borders. Such a keeper does not fear the wilderness inside them, because they have walked through it consciously, again and again, until nothing there remains completely unknown. This is the deepest secret behind self-mastery. It is not achieved by building higher walls around your consciousness. It is achieved by expanding your consciousness until there is less and less inside you that can ambush you from the dark. I think often of a dream I had during the most difficult period of my own life, when I feared, quite genuinely, that I was losing my mind rather than mastering it. In the dream, I descended into a cave beneath my childhood home, and in the deepest chamber I found not a monster, as I had feared, but an old quiet fire burning steadily, waiting patiently for someone to finally arrive and tend to it. I understood upon waking that everything I had feared discovering within myself was not there to destroy me. It was there waiting to be claimed. This is what I want you to carry with you long after this video ends. You will not control your mind by defeating it, silencing it, or forcing it into obedience through sheer willpower alone. You will control it gradually and imperfectly by becoming someone who is no longer afraid to know it completely. Every fear you refuse to examine will continue to rule you invisibly. Every part of yourself you refuse to accept will continue expressing itself in ways you cannot predict or choose. But every fragment you bring consciously into the light loses its power to ambush you from the dark. The mind was never meant to be your prison. It was always meant to become your home. Every room finally opened, every hidden fire finally tended, every fragment of yourself finally welcomed back from exile. And perhaps, if you listen closely enough to your own life from this moment forward, you will begin to notice something I noticed long ago. The voice that once controlled you without your permission slowly grows quieter, not because you fought it into silence, but because you finally turned, faced it directly, and asked its name.